Okay, so now following up on our study of North America, remember when I was a kid, I used to think that, or I was taught that North America was Mexico, United States, and Canada. In fact, NAFTA includes those three. So you have to kind of change, if that's the way you were taught, you have to change your thinking a little bit for the purposes of our book, because our book defines Middle America as Mexico and the countries that make up what are conventionally thought of as Central America: Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Panama, etc. Um, and the book does make the distinction. They say, quite often this area, this region is referred to as Latin America, but that does a disservice to the native populations, the populations of African descent, et cetera, that make up this region, to think that everyone is just Latin. It's very much like if you were to call Canada and America, or the US, if we called them Anglo America, that would be a disservice as well, because it would not acknowledge people of different racial backgrounds. So I like this concept of Middle America, and it does include Mexico, as well as the Caribbean, as well as, of course, what is more conventionally thought of as Central America. Okay, so we're talking about Middle America, and you can see pretty clearly why it's called Middle America, because up here is North America, and down here is South America, and Middle America is smack dab in the middle, as you would expect. Now, one thing that's interesting about Middle America is you notice how very wide it is. The book points out the fact that it's much wider than it is tall if we go from its western extremity all the way through the Leeward and Windward Islands there in the Caribbean. Now, if we just really focus on the mainland region, then it's essentially about the same, as wide as it is tall, perhaps. But including the islands, the Greater Antilles, Lesser Antilles, now we have a region that is much wider than it is tall. But the most important feature, of course, is this connecting. The fact that it is the land route that gets you from North America to South America. And therein lies its economic significance, its political significance, and of course its name, Middle America. A couple of important vocabulary words or jargon words here: NAFTA, which most of us are pretty familiar with, the North American Free Trade Agreement, as well as maquiladoras, which are those factories that are typically located in northern Mexico, which essentially import raw materials, quite often from the US, assemble products, and then package them up and send them back across the border for sale in America. Also interesting is the fact that maquiladoras certainly benefited from NAFTA, because American-based companies realized that it was economically beneficial for them to hire lower wage Mexican workers. But notice also, the other interesting thing is that the dynamic has changed yet again, as US companies have realized, well, even cheaper labor is available in Asia. And so depending on the product, and of course you have to take into consideration transportation costs, sometimes it makes more sense to actually assemble things in the Far East. And that has put pressure on Mexico to become more competitive. Another very interesting video I strongly encourage you to check out: globalization. Are you for it? Are you against it? Like many political issues, there's a lot more nuance, and this video is a good example of that. Globalization is almost a genie kind of left out of the bottle. It's not going back in. It's a matter of how can the globalization be harnessed to benefit everyone, make sure that everyone benefits. That's the hard part. But this video is definitely a good introduction to the topic. Okay, so this graphic features the metro area of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, which is right on the Texas-Mexico border. And good question in here, which is, because the idea of a wall is still a big political issue here in the US. So what if you took both Mexico and the US perspective? What would be a pro as well as a con to a permanent physical border between Mexico and the United States? Okay, so Middle America is made up of essentially four regions. You got Mexico, Extends down here. There's the Yucatan Peninsula. You have Central America, this grouping of 7 countries that really connect Mexico to South America. You have the Greater Antilles. Greater Antilles includes the large islands, Puerto Rico, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Jamaica, and then you have the Lesser Antilles. Lesser Antilles includes the Bahamas, as well as the Windward and Leeward Islands. Okay, here's a good geography word, isthmus. Useful not only to describe a narrow section of land between 2 bodies of water. That's part of the reason why it's so useful. And it's also useful in rhyming with Christmas in songs. So, but that's what an isthmus is. An isthmus is a narrow strip of land that is bounded on both sides by water. Not to be confused with a peninsula. Peninsula is a stretch of land that is surrounded on 3 sides by water, such as the Florida Peninsula. Another important geography term is archipelago. Archipelago is an island chain. So you can see the Windward and Leeward Islands are an archipelago, a grouping of islands that quite often were formed from the same tectonic reason, either through the convergence of plates that essentially cause mountain building, or in some cases a volcanic hotspot in the middle of a plate, such as in the Hawaiian Islands are an archipelago as well. Okay, so in Middle America there are a lot of natural hazards, including earthquakes. Earthquakes have rocked Mexico City, they've rocked Haiti. Volcanoes also. This is a very tectonically active region, so volcanoes are also an issue. And of course, hurricanes. Middle America is largely located within the tropics, and that's where tropical storms develop into hurricanes. And the path is usually from east to west across the Atlantic, where, again, the Caribbean islands and even Mexico is exposed to hurricanes on its eastern border along the Gulf of Mexico, and there are also hurricanes that develop in the eastern Pacific, which can affect the western coastal regions of Mexico. Okay, a couple of good discussion questions go along with these graphics here. First of all, what visual coding unites the physical map? This is the physical map over here, and the diagram of altitudinal zonation. So can you see how the colorations, the colors here? Here's your Tierra Caliente, kind of the green is indicated on the maps, on the physical map with the green, and so forth and so on. So there is a correlation there between these 2 diagrams by color. So it says using the coding and the diagram's list of crops, identify what areas might be best suited to produce certain crops, and in which zones would population density be highest and why, and which would density be lowest and why. So where, if you had to choose where to live, where would you live and why would you do that? Quite often deforestation occurs because subsistence living requires it. Farmers are trying to farm relatively nutrient-poor soils, and of course it leads to all kinds of environmental problems, such as flooding and runoff and that sort of thing. The book describes the pre-European cultures of Middle America, which were primarily Maya as well as Aztec. The Mayas tended to settle in the lower elevations, and the Aztecs were in slightly higher elevations, but both had really dynamic and quite often quite vigorous civilizations pre-Europeans. The Europeans essentially forced them off the land in a lot of cases, and quite often introduced illnesses that decimated the populations. During the colonial period, notice there was it wasn't just one country that came in and settled this entire region. There was actually a lot of competition between the British and the Spanish and the French and the Dutch, all laying claim to different portions of the Caribbean as well as parts of Central America and into Mexico. And some of those cultural differences are still reflected in either the cultures on these in the particular islands, sometimes language, religious practices, etc., are still reflected to this day. The colonial era came to an end in the 19th century, largely as a result of what's called the Monroe Doctrine. President Monroe, the American President Monroe, essentially opposed any European meddling or colonialization of any location in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so in this this section where they discuss the mainland versus the rimland, pay particular attention to a couple of terms. First of all, mestizo. These are people of mixed ancestry. And also notice the hacienda system versus the plantation system, as that definitely is a marked difference between the two regions. Okay, so this is a nice 7-page animation sequence that I encourage you to check out at the address listed here. And what you'll learn is, first of all, it'll reinforce the distinction between the mainland and the rimland. It'll feature some of the colonial history of the different, particularly the Caribbean islands, and also it'll make sure you understand the difference between the plantation system and the hacienda system. Okay, it's a very interesting graphic here that shows that despite the fact that Middle America is really not that large geographically, there are huge disparities, particularly when it comes to economies. You can see that the wealthy locations are in red, and the poor locations are in yellow. And you can see what's going on here. The farther interior you are in Middle America, the poorer you are. Mexico is one of the richer states in the region. Why is that? It's because of the access to the American market. Panama is one of the richer states in the region. Why is that? Because of the flow of goods through the Panama Canal. So it's all about connections. Location, location, location. Here's an interesting slide. Have you ever vacationed in Middle America? Have you ever gone to the Caribbean on a cruise? Have you ever gone to Cozumel or one of the beach locations in Mexico? Have you ever gone to Central America, what we call typically Central America, Honduras or Costa Rica or Guatemala on a mission trip or something like that? What is the impact of the tourist industry? And this is another good question. Notice that in Middle America there are a lot of countries for a relatively small region. So you have a lot of small countries, small populations, small geographic areas, and therefore a relatively few number of resources. And the question is small a good thing when it comes to being a country? We've talked about Russia, where being too big is not necessarily a good thing, but what about being too small? It's kind of like the little mom and pop stores. How can they compete against the Walmarts of the world? Economically, sometimes it's just not feasible. The question is a small country able to compete in a global marketplace? Well, read in the book and see what you think. Okay, so this slide describes Mexico's physical geography, or its physiography. And again, notice that it mentions a couple of geography terms you should be familiar with. 2 peninsulas. You have the Baja California Peninsula. You have the Yucatan Peninsula. And then you also have an isthmus. This narrow area is considered an isthmus. Then we also have a lot of terrains, a lot of mountains. You have the Sierra Madre Occidental, you got the Sierra Madre Oriental, and then you have this valley region or this plateau region in between. And at the very southernmost extent of that plateau region is Mexico City, the capital. It's sometimes referred to as El DF, which is the Distrito Federal. In the previous chapter, you may recall that Mexico was generally thought of as being more well-to-do among the countries in Middle America, but that economic prosperity is not uniform. You have a core area, the Mexico City area, and certainly northern Mexico, where the maquiladoras are. Those are areas that are thriving economically. Portions of the Yucatan Peninsula are thriving economically, but there are also areas that are really struggling. So it's not all prosperous across the entire country of Mexico. The book refers to the amount of urbanization that is going on in Mexico, highly urbanized for a country that has the economic problems that it has. And nowhere is it more urbanized than in its main city, Mexico City, which has eclipsed Tokyo as being the world's largest city, and it continues to grow. And with that growth comes all kinds of problems, not only differences in economics, where you have a huge disparity between the rich and the poor, but also the the environmental challenges brought on by such a large population, supplying them with fresh water, which is a real problem. Pollution issues, just geologic issues. The fact that the city is actually sinking because of the loss of groundwater. So all kinds of issues going on in Mexico City. A couple of important vocab words in this slide: acculturation versus transculturation. And certainly Mexico was influenced by the Spanish colonialism, but it just wasn't just a one-way street. There was kind of an interplay between the indigenous culture and the newly arrived culture. And so what has resulted is more of a trans culture. And particularly how things have changed since the early 20th century, after a revolution helped to break up a lot of the large landholders and distribute more fairly. The problem being that in some cases, when you break up and have a lot of individual landholders, especially when the land is not that great or not that arable, you have very low yields and therefore a lot of poverty. The subsistence farming is tough to grow a large economy out of. So there is a certain need for large-scale commercial agriculture to be able to produce enough not only to feed yourself, but also to export food and therefore generate revenue for the country. Okay, we've already mentioned maquiladoras before, actually, in the previous chapter, and we actually hinted at the fact that at one time it was an easy decision for American companies or any other company to locate in Mexico for the cheaper labor source. What has happened is that even cheaper labor has become available in portions of East Asia and South Asia, and that has caused the maquiladoras to have to change their strategy in order to retain companies and to continue to manufacture products. Okay, so we mentioned in reference to Canada, if you recall back in the North America section, how perceived disparity between regions can often lead to a little bit of political unease. And that's kind of the case in Mexico as well, where the North has been economically benefited more from NAFTA. And the southern part of the country has really lagged behind economically. And that disparity has then caused a little bit of political instability. Okay, so here are some questions to consider as you take a look at these maps. We're looking at a map of the states of Mexico as well as the economic and political disparities map. And questions are, of the large states, you pick out the ones, which are the large states, which are rich and which are poor. Speculate as to why there are those differences. And of the small states, which ones are rich and which ones are poor. And think about why you have those differences between those states as well. Now, one of the other big factors and causes of continued instability in Mexico is the drug trade and Mexico's relative inability to bring it under control. Now, of course, one thing that must always be kept in mind, and why Mexico can't be held completely to blame, is the fact that if there were not a demand, there would not be a supply chain. And so North America has to take some responsibility for the chaos that quite often results from the drug trade in Mexico. If there was no demand for these products, then there wouldn't be a supply chain working its way through Mexico and through parts of Middle America. Certainly when you look at this list of things that Mexico needs to do if it's going to be successful in the 21st century, it is quite daunting. It's easy to list on paper. It's a lot tougher to enact. The question of how to reduce inequalities from one region to another, how to close the gap between the rich and the poor. That's a problem that all countries wind up facing, but it must be faced because if you have enough, if enough of a disparity builds up and is allowed to build up, eventually revolution is right around the corner. Okay, so remember what we call Middle America is made up of 4 regions: Mexico, Central America, the Greater Antilles, the Lesser Antilles. So here's the Central America part of it. It's these 7 nations that connect Mexico and South America. So those include Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. And one thing that's quite interesting about this very thin, it's called an isthmus, especially this section is an isthmus of Panama, is that there's a large terrain difference. And notice how the terrain is quite varied. Guatemala, some very tall mountains in Guatemala. And this leads to a lot of biodiversity because you're going to have a lot of different critters able to live at different elevations. Now in Mexico, that's where the Aztecs tended to, the Aztec civilization predominated before Europeans arrived. And in Central America, mostly the Mayans who lived in the lower elevations that civilization thrived before the arrival of Europeans. Okay, so Belize, which is located right here, kind of on the edge of the Yucatan, on the eastern edge of the Yucatan Peninsula, is actually a relative newcomer, let's say, to Central America. It's often kind of looked at as more of has a history more like a Caribbean island, in the sense that it was a British dependency until 1981. As we move into the heart of Central America, remember we showed you in the last chapter the difference in per capita wealth. And remember, the closer you were to the center, the farther away you were from either the United States or from South America, the poorer the countries. And so certainly Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua are case in point, the central section of Central America is where there's a fair amount of poverty. Not a whole lot of industrialization in these areas. The main crops have fluctuated in value. You've got bananas and coffee and sugar and that sort of thing. But still, enough political unrest has occurred in these locations over the years that they've not been able to really get an economy, a vigorous economy going. Costa Rica, on the other hand, has been kind of a diamond in the rough here, partly because of its long-standing political stability and democratic tradition, and government has helped it to achieve the highest standard of living in the region, greatest literacy rate, and greatest life expectancy. It also has benefited from a fair amount of ecotourism. And as was mentioned in the last chapter, Panama is well-to-do, relative to the rest of the countries in Middle America, largely because of the Panama Canal. Again, remember that it is an isthmus, and there's a canal that runs straight through the country, which allows access from the Caribbean Sea, all the way to the Pacific, and that's very key. It saves ships from having to go around South America to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Okay, so now we've covered Mexico and Central America. Now we're going to move into the Greater Antilles, which are these 4 large islands in the Caribbean, and then the Lesser Antilles, which include the Bahamas and the islands that make up the eastern part of the Caribbean. And one thing to pay attention to as you're reading is the fact that these are all relatively small nations, and a lot of them need to import food. That's always a tough sign for your economy. If you're not able to feed yourself, then you're not going to be an economic powerhouse. Interesting with respect to the Caribbean nations, and perhaps as a result of their colonial history, that there is a great amount of disparity or stratification when it comes to ethnicity, and that continues until even to the present day. Cuba gained its independence from the Spanish, essentially in the beginning of the 20th century. The U.S. backed a dictatorship for the first half of the 20th century until Fidel Castro, in his revolution, changed the government and became a communist government. And so Cuba was allied with the USSR for much of the second half of the 20th century. In fact, very tense in 1962 in the Bay of Pigs situation. And then when the USSR fell, that sent Cuba into a bit of a tailspin because they lost the material support they've been getting from the USSR for all those years. They turned to Venezuela in recent years to kind of keep themselves afloat. Cuba is relatively lacking when it comes to fossil fuels, and so Venezuela was able to help them as far as that goes. So there's been different allies during the course of the years. More recently, now that Fidel Castro is no longer in the picture, there has been a liberalization of some of the policies, and on the part of the U.S., the U.S. has indicated an interest in opening doors a little bit more to Cuba in recent years. Okay, so Jamaica is located just south of Cuba. It's a much smaller island. It is a British Commonwealth, so English is its official language. And like many of the island nations, it is limited as far as its ability to feed itself, so it must import most of its necessities. It relies largely on tourism as one of its main industries. There's another island that makes up part of the Greater Antilles, and this island is actually usually referred to as Hispaniola, made up of 2 countries. On the western side of it is Haiti, and Haiti is probably the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. And certainly one thing that's not helped it is the many natural disasters that it has been victim of. It is right in the path of hurricanes, and so Several hurricanes have hit it in recent years, and in 2010, a ruinous earthquake hit Port-au-Prince, which is the capital, and the country is still recovering from all those disasters. Okay, so the other half, or the other portion of the island of Hispaniola, the eastern side, is the Dominican Republic. And despite its checkered political past, it has had political relative stability in the last few decades, and that has helped it to kind of climb out of the same spiral downward that Haiti has succumbed to. Okay, Puerto Rico is the smallest of the islands in the Greater Antilles, and it is a commonwealth of the United States. And that means that it does receive aid from the U.S., but residents of Puerto Rico do not pay income tax to the United States. There has been a push over the last, several decades for statehood, but it is still not clear as to whether or not Puerto Rico will ever be brought into the U.S. As a state. Okay, then the Lesser Antilles is the fourth region of Middle America, and it would be too exhaustive to go through all the different individual countries and islands here, but suffice it to say that when you consider the Leeward Islands and the Windward Islands, all of these are countries that quite often depend very much on tourism, and they also face the issue of being so small that they have a hard time making it on their own. A lot of them do need to maintain a political relationship with some of their former colonial rulers. This is a very interesting video. When we study geography in this manner, kind of going chapter by chapter, module by module, we tend to think about one region at a time and lose sight of the forest. We're so focused on the trees, we kind of lose sight of the forest, the fact that quite often the entire world is interconnected. And we say this with respect to globalization because trade impacts, it's not just, just trade with your neighbors. You can actually trade with corporations on the other side of the world. And globalization is also true as far as the transfer of ideas. It used to be that we weren't connected, but now with the internet, we're all connected. We can share ideas and learn from other parts of the world that are far flung. But we also must take into consideration the globalization when it comes to the environment. And that's what this video is about. It's about the fact that Trinidad, an area in the Caribbean, is experiencing the effects of global warming as a result of a different part of the world. So they're getting pollution from another part of the world that is most likely linked to global warming. Very interesting video. Okay, this is a pretty fun animation. It gives you a chance to test your knowledge. It's kind of a map skill sort of thing, placing the proper countries, or putting the countries in their place. One thing you'll notice as you're playing this is that it's a little tricky to drag them to the proper spot to drop. So you'll just kind of play around with that. But as you do this, not only will you get a chance to place the countries in the right locations, but then a couple of slides on, you'll actually get a chance to place some of the border towns that run across, that are essentially in northern Mexico, right across from the United States, be able to put those in their place as well.